It started on a rainy Thursday, the kind where the clouds feel heavy enough to crush the streets and the air smells like wet pavement. I was standing in front of my old café, the one I had built from scratch, watching the lights flicker inside. Except now, it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to someone else. More specifically, it belonged to the person who had once been my best friend and the one who had stolen everything from me. 3 years earlier, the café had been my dream. I poured my savings into it, spent sleepless nights sanding counters, painting walls, and perfecting recipes. My so-called friend, Daniel, was there from day one, helping, smiling, laughing with me as if we were building it together. He'd even invested a small sum, nothing compared to my own, but enough to make him feel like part of it. What I didn't know was that while I was building the dream, he was building a trap. He quietly convinced a few suppliers to put contracts in his name. He whispered to the landlord about unreliable payments and mismanagement when I was busy running the shop. And when my father fell ill, forcing me to spend weeks away, Daniel filed paperwork to have me removed as the primary leaseholder, claiming I'd abandoned the business. By the time I came back, the keys wouldn't fit the lock. The betrayal stung worse than the loss. I could live without the café, but knowing it was Daniel, someone who knew my secrets, my struggles, and my dreams, who had ripped it away, that was the part that ate at me every day. For months, I avoided that street entirely. But life has a way of circling you back to the places you don't want to see. That rainy Thursday, I ended up right in front of it, staring through the glass at Daniel inside. The decor was almost the same. He'd kept my color scheme, my layout, even my menu items, just with his name on them. But what I noticed most was the emptiness. A couple of bored customers, a distracted barista, and Daniel pacing behind the counter, looking stressed. It was in that moment that the seed of an idea took root. Revenge. Not the loud, destructive kind that ends up in courtrooms or the news. I wanted something slower, sweeter, the kind that tastes better the longer it simmers. I started small. A few weeks later, I opened a pop-up stall at the weekend farmers market, selling pastries and coffee under a new brand name, Second Cup Stories. I didn't advertise heavily, just relied on word of mouth. But the recipes? They were my best, better than anything I'd ever served at the cafe. The pastries melted in your mouth. The coffee was brewed from beans I'd sourced from a small family farm overseas, beans I had never told Daniel about. People noticed. They noticed enough that on Saturdays, customers began skipping his cafe to visit my stall instead. And when I smiled and handed them their coffee, I'd say, I used to run that little place down the street before someone decided it was theirs. I never used his name. I didn't need to. The real twist came 6 months later when I found out from one of my old suppliers that Daniel had been struggling to keep up with payments. Apparently, his reputation for late orders and questionable practices was spreading. The beauty of it? I hadn't lifted a finger in that part. It was all his own doing. Still, I wanted to finish the story the right way. I took the profits from my market stall and signed a lease directly across the street from his cafe. My new place opened with a soft launch, warm lights, the smell of fresh bread spilling into the night air, live acoustic music on weekends. Customers poured in, some curious, others loyal from the old days. From my window, I could see his place, nearly empty, Daniel staring over at mine with that look. The look of someone realizing they'd built their success on someone else's work, and now that foundation was gone. I never gloated. I never even spoke to him. But every morning when I unlocked my door, the warm hum of conversation and the hiss of steaming milk greeting me, I felt it, quiet, satisfying, and complete. It wasn't just that I'd won. It was that I'd done it without becoming like him. I'd built something better, not by tearing him down, but by being everything he wasn't. That was the sweetest revenge of all. And though no one else may ever tell the story exactly like I lived it, I know it by heart. The untold story of the sweetest revenge ever is mine, and I wouldn't change a single line. If you want, I can also make a cinematic, tension-filled version of this story, with more psychological mind games between the characters, so the revenge feels even sharper. That would make it feel more like a thriller than a drama. Would you like me to make that next? The weeks after opening my cafe across the street felt almost surreal. I didn't plan on watching him, but every time I glanced out the window, my eyes found Daniel. Sometimes, he'd be standing at his counter, arms crossed, pretending not to see me. Other times, he'd lean against the doorway, scanning the street like a man who could feel the tide pulling away from him but didn't know how to swim. At first, I thought my presence alone was the sting, but then came the whispers. Customers who drifted in from his cafe brought their stories about orders that took too long, staff who kept quitting, suppliers who stopped delivering. Someone even told me they'd overheard Daniel snapping at a customer. The charm he'd once worn like a tailored suit was unraveling. I never confirmed or denied anything when people told me these stories. I just listened with a polite smile, offering them another warm scone or a second pour of coffee on the house. The less I said, the more they seemed to draw their own conclusions. That was the beauty of it. Reputation is like glass. Once it cracks, the lines only spread. It was late autumn when things truly turned. My cafe was buzzing with life. College students hunched over laptops, couples sharing desserts, locals chatting like old friends. Outside, the first hints of frost clung to the windows. Across the street, Daniel's place was lit but hollow, a few lonely tables filled, the rest sitting empty like an abandoned theater. Then came the day he crossed over. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where time moves slowly. I was wiping down the counter when I saw him step inside. For a moment, the room seemed to tighten around us. The customers glanced up, sensing the shift. He looked older, more worn down than I remembered. "Nice place," he said, his voice low, almost grudging. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone light, polite. The way you'd speak to a stranger. He looked around for a moment, his eyes scanning the details. The polished wood counters, the cozy lighting, the faint smell of cinnamon in the air. He knew. Every piece of it was deliberate. Every detail whispered, "This is what you could have had if you hadn't been you." "I guess business is good," he said finally. I smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that needed words. He lingered for a beat, as if there was more he wanted to say, but in the end, he just turned and left. I watched him cross back to his cafe without looking over his shoulder. That night, I stayed long after closing, sitting at a corner table with the lights dimmed, the hum of the espresso machine cooling in the silence. I realized then that my revenge wasn't about winning customers or reclaiming some lost dream. It was about something much quieter and more powerful, reminding him every single day that he hadn't beaten me. He'd only made me stronger. Over the next months, his cafe faded into the background. Eventually, the closed sign went up for good, the windows papered over. A "for lease" notice appeared, curling slightly at the corners. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory dance. I simply went about my day, greeting customers, baking bread, serving coffee. Life moved forward, and with every step, the past lost its grip on me. The sweetest revenge wasn't watching him fail. It was knowing I'd rebuilt without him, that I had created something he could never touch. And every time the morning sun poured through my cafe windows, warming the tables where friends and strangers shared moments together, I knew the story didn't need to be told to anyone else. Because the truest victories? They live quietly, in the hearts of the people who earned them. If you want, I can now give you a psychological cat-and-mouse mind game version of this story, where the revenge is more manipulative and thrilling, almost like a movie script. That would make it darker, more suspenseful, and even more satisfying. Would you like me to do that? Winter came, and with it, the long nights and the smell of wood smoke drifting over the city. My cafe became a refuge. People escaped the cold to sink into the worn leather chairs, cupping warm mugs, trading laughter while the windows steamed over. From my place behind the counter, I could feel it, the heartbeat of something alive, something mine. Across the street, Daniel's cafe looked tired. The lights burned, but dimly. A few lone figures would slip in and out, never lingering long. Even from a distance, I could tell the staff had changed again. He never could keep people around for long. I'd hear snippets in the market, how he was short on rent, how suppliers were cutting him off, how customers didn't feel welcome there anymore. I never denied or confirmed a thing. Silence can be sharper than a blade if you wield it right. But my revenge wasn't just about beating him in business. I wanted him to feel it, slowly, like water dripping into a bucket until the weight finally made it tip. So I began doing something subtle, hosting events that were unmistakably tied to the old cafe's past. One Friday night, I organized a founders' night for local businesses, where I shared stories about my journey, minus the betrayal, but with enough hints for anyone who remembered. Another weekend, I reintroduced my Sunday morning specials, the exact breakfast plates I'd created back in my original cafe, plated perfectly and served with my signature latte art. People talked. They compared. They remembered. Daniel must have noticed because I started catching glimpses of him at odd hours, standing just far enough from my cafe to pretend he was looking at something else. Once, I even saw him watching through the glass as a line formed out my door on a Saturday morning. I didn't wave. I just kept working, my hands moving automatically, my smile easy and genuine. Then came the storm. It was a brutal night in late January, wind howling, snow whipping sideways, turning the street into a white blur. Most shops had closed early, but my place was still open, packed with people sheltering from the weather. The music was low, the lights warm, the smell of cinnamon rolls in the air. That's when the door swung open and in stumbled Daniel, shaking snow from his coat. He looked not angry, not smug, just defeated. His cafe, I learned later, had lost power hours earlier. He'd been wandering the street, looking for somewhere to wait it out. I didn't say a word as he came up to the counter. He glanced at the menu, but I knew he already recognized every item on it. After a moment, he ordered a coffee, paid in cash, took a seat by the window, staring out into the storm. For nearly an hour, he sat there in silence, the low hum of my cafe wrapping around him. My customers laughed, clinked mugs, traded stories over slices of pie. The place felt alive, warm, and full. His place, across the street, was a dark shadow behind falling snow. When he finally left, I noticed he'd left his mug empty, but perfectly placed on the saucer, the handle turned just so. A small thing, but it struck me. He knew the etiquette because once he'd learned it from me. A month later, his cafe closed for good. The sign came down, the windows were papered over, and for weeks the space sat hollow. I didn't cheer. I didn't toast the moment. I just unlocked my door the next morning, turned on the lights, and started another day. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge wasn't the sight of his failure. It was the quiet certainty that I'd taken back my life, rebuilt something unshakable, and done it without ever once lowering myself to his level. He had stolen a chapter from my story, but I'd gone on to write an entire new book. And he was just a footnote.